Welcome to the Integrate This podcast. Today we have a special guest with us, Kevin Smith from Dakota State University, where he is an associate professor. And we actually got in touch with Kevin at the TIES conference in South Dakota and attended one of Kevin's sessions, which I thought was really great. And it's all about presenting and how to do so effectively and use text and visuals in a meaningful way. And I think Kevin's going to share a really great wealth of knowledge with us on that topic. And so, Kevin, welcome. Glad to have you. And maybe start by telling us a little bit about where you're from and how you got to DSU and talking about the creative process and presentations.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Thanks, David and Jeremy. It's been a while since I've seen David, but nice to meet you, Jeremy. I'm excited to share information about visual design with you on this podcast. So just some background on me. Like David said, I'm a professor, associate professor at Dakota State University. I'm in the College of Education. I teach students how to teach math and use technology in the classroom. This is my 12th year doing that. I spend about half my time there with undergraduate students. Those are the students that are working to become teachers. And then I spend about half my time with our graduate students. And the graduate students are working on their master's degree in educational technology. So it's a really nice mix of working with pre-service teachers and in-service teachers with those topics, math and technology. And I started out my career as a high school math teacher. So I was in the K-12 classroom. And then I was always interested in math and tech. And so I went back to graduate school at the University of Nebraska and studied instructional technology. And then when I finished that degree, when I finished my master's degree, I went to work for an organization as an instructional designer. If you're not familiar with instructional design, I think some people are, but it's kind of a new term for some people. But I was basically designing curriculum materials for teachers and students. So I was using my background with teaching and pedagogy and my content knowledge with math and technology to develop instructional materials. And an important part of designing instructional materials was making sure they were visually appealing and the visual design enhanced the learning and hopefully helped people learn more. So that was kind of my career before coming to DSU. And then kind of in addition to that, just kind of a personal note about me is I've always loved art. And in fact, when I went to college, I thought about maybe going into architecture. And now as a hobby, I'm an illustrator. I have a side business that my daughter and I started called Kevin and Kaya, and we create illustrated stationery. And we sell it all over. Now we sell it all over the world. So it started out as this little hobby business, and now we have our items in 180 stores all over the world. And then kind of related to that illustration hobby business, I also just recently wrote and illustrated my first children's book about math and a girl that doesn't like math. So that's a lot about me, actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. I could see how, your passions kind of seem to have blended together for you, which is like really, really cool. And, don't be afraid if you want to promote your book a little bit later here too.
Right.
We'll definitely give you a spot for that.
Cool.
But, I think it's great how you talk about passion for design that you have too, visual design, because my wife is actually was a fine art major in college and minored in graphic design. Won't say how many years ago in case she gets mad at me. But she still definitely kind of has this eye for making things visually appealing, like you talked about too. So I'm kind of curious then when it comes to, in education, as educators, we make a lot of presentations. We just do, right? It's a way to convey information and points we need to get across. So, when you're approaching creating a new presentation, how do you blend that creative part with that need to effectively communicate a message?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. I feel like my work as an instructional designer and as a teacher designing lessons, I think really kind of informs how I approach creating presentations too. I feel like I use a backward design approach oftentimes, thinking about what is the goal of this presentation? What do I want the audience to really get out of it? What I want them to take away from it? And then, so that's really the starting place, thinking about what's the message you want to get across. And then, think about how you're going to get there. What's the, how you're going to organize your information? How am I going to introduce the material to get students or my audience engaged in what I'm talking about? And so I feel like really focusing on what's the key takeaways that I want to get across. And then once you're really clear on that, then thinking about how am I going to keep my audience focused and engaged, and what kind of creative things can I add to my presentation to do that. So, in terms of creative things, I'm trying to think about how can I make this information relevant and interesting to my audience. So thinking about good examples that they might be able to relate to, thinking about things they might be interested in pop culture. What kind of movies might connect with my story, or music, or whatever. So I feel like thinking about all sorts of different multimedia things that people are used to seeing. How does that connect with my ultimate goal of my presentation? So that's kind of my thought process as I'm putting together a presentation. So it's, a lot of it is the visuals, but part of it is, probably the most important part is what's the goal? What are you trying to get across to your audience?
Yeah, and I know when we attended ties and we came to your session, I think that it's almost inevitable that as I was watching your presentation and looking at the different ways that you approach things, or have tips on how to create presentations, you automatically start to reflect on presentations that you've made. So that's what I did a lot of. I was like thinking about stuff that I've made and if I've incorporated some of those ideas. And so when you're working with students, let's say, or colleagues, what are the things that you see as the most common mistakes that they make, and then how do you help them avoid that?
Yeah, good. I like that question. So I like your comment about when you're in a presentation and you're reflecting on your own presentations. So just a quick little kind of side story there. So one of the classes I teach in our graduate program is it's called Visual Design for Learning. And my students, this is really oftentimes the first time they've ever had a formal class on visual design. They were probably education majors in college. They've been teachers, and they maybe have an eye for design, but they haven't had any formal training in it. So this is their first time. And so when they start to learn about some of the principles, and some of the activities I have them do are go find a bad design and tell me why it's bad. Go find a good design and tell me why it's good. And at the end of the class, oftentimes the students are a little bit like, they enjoy it, but they're like, I can't look at anything the same anymore. They are like kind of critiquing the things that they see. It's billboards or commercials, or a title screen of a movie or a presentation. So anyway, so I think that's a good thing to kind of reflect on your own design and think about how you can make it better. So your question, common mistakes. So I want to share my screen and highlight a few things that I see a lot. So let me jump down. I'll just share here. All right. Can you see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Let me get rid of this little thing here. And I'll go back. All right. So the most common mistakes. So these are the three that I identified: too much text, visuals don't add value, and not enough white space. And I'll talk a little bit about each one and show you some examples. So too much text is kind of an obvious one. I think we've all been in presentations where there's been way too much text on the slide. So my tip here is just limit your text and bullet points. So here's a really poor example. And this is just a screenshot that I grabbed. But you can see a lot of text. It's actually pixelated too, so it's hard to read. So just not good. Here's one that I created. So at least the text is easy to read and clear, but there's a lot of it. And then sometimes we do this, we add backgrounds, which maybe don't really help. They don't help us help it make it more readable. But here's an example of a presentation that does a nice job. So this is actually me sitting in a presentation, reflecting on what I'm seeing. And I actually pulled out my phone and took a picture of it because I really liked what this presenter did. And this was a presentation that I was at in Indianapolis. The presenter, whose name was Dan Meyer, he's a math teacher. And I just love this. He had 5 bullet points or 5 items, and each one had 2 words: identify variables, formulate models. And I went to this presentation years ago. I've talked about this slide several times, so that helps me remember it. But those ideas, because he was able to limit his text and bullet points, those ideas really stuck with me. So I think it's important to just really try to limit your text. Here's a great quote from Thomas Jefferson: "The most valuable of all talents is that of never using 2 words when one will do." Being concise and succinct is sometimes more challenging than putting lots of words on the screen, but it really does make a difference. So the mistake is adding too much text and having too many bullets. So you really want to try to limit that. And then this is the question that I try to get people to think about: can I be more concise? Read, put your slide together, read it, and then just ask yourself, could I be a little more concise here? And then the second mistake is oftentimes we see presentations where visuals are just put in there just to be put in there. There's no real value. So here's an example. Here's a poor example that I put together. The most important thing on this screen is the objective for the day, which is to learn about order of operations. But I got all sorts of stuff going on here. My name, my class period, some cheesy clip art. So if I start to get rid of some of these things, the learner can really focus on what's important. I don't need all of this extra stuff. And maybe this is all I really need. Today, we're going to learn order of operations. And adding visuals can help in terms of keeping students or your students or your audience engaged, but you just want to make sure you're adding visuals that really add value. So here's another example. If this was your slide, you're going to talk about a project. It's going to last 3 weeks. If the project is about growing flowers, maybe it makes sense. But if it isn't, then I would say that adding a flower to this slide is just, it isn't adding value. This would be an example of adding value, because this calendar, especially if I had 3 weeks highlighted, would help drive home your point. So the text and the visual kind of go together. So that's the second tip to avoid that mistake. And then the third one, and here's the question, what point am I trying to get across? So look at your slide and just ask yourself that question. And then the third one is, this is one that really resonates, or maybe this really comes to life for my students in this graduate class I teach, and that is utilizing white space. So if you haven't had formal training in graphic design or visual design, just that whole concept of white space can be new to you. So here's a slide that I put together. It's got lots of information about DSU, but you'll notice everything is kind of jammed together. And this is very common when people put together visuals. They feel like, well, if there's room on the slide, I need to put something in. I need to fill it up. I need to put something in there. So white space doesn't have to be white. It's just the space around the objects. It's the space between the image and the edge of the slide. It's the space between your bullet points. So if I change this and add white space, I'm going to let you see what happens. So I got rid of the logo, but I added space around everything. And now it's so much easier to read. So we went from this to this, and really all I did was give all the items a little more space. So utilizing white space. And then the question I tell people to ask themselves is this: can the items on my slide breathe? If they're all jammed together, that makes it really difficult. So those are my tips. Those are my tips, or those are the common mistakes and some tips to kind of address those things.
And do you think, just as a follow-up, the one thing I noticed about the first slide, it compared to the second one of the history of DSU, is that the first one is right away overwhelming because you're not really sure where to focus your attention. Whereas I feel like the second one spaces things out in a way where you can focus your attention and kind of work your way through the slide, as opposed to the first one where you're kind of like bouncing around and not really sure what to look at. Um, do you ever find like there's when people add too much stuff to a slide, um, do you ever is there any conversation about like there's a misconception maybe about whenever we're talking, we have to use a lot of language because we're like trying to explain something. But when you're showing a presentation, it's not the same type of delivery. And actually, like if you have the bullet points up, like the one good slide that you showed,
Yeah.
the presenter is actually going to expound on whatever is on the presentation, right? And so do you find that there's maybe like a misconception where if someone is putting too much on a slide, they view it as the same type of delivery, or as if they've got to say the same exact thing from the slide? They have to communicate all of that at once.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there that's important that I talk about in my visual design class too, and that is like other design things we do to focus the audience's attention on things. So we use visual hierarchy, we use contrast, we use layout, and we know sort of the patterns that, a lot of times they start in the upper left-hand corner and they move across to the right and then they move down. So we kind of know the patterns that people follow. And I feel like, I feel like the visual with good visual design and a good like presentation message, you can really have an impact on what you want your audience to focus on and when you want them to focus on it. So yeah, I think I'm not sure if I got to your question, but definitely the visual design impacts how what people take away from the message you're trying to get across.
Right. So what are some of those core elements then that, like a really great presentation is going to contain, maybe not on every single slide, but through the whole presentation itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think um, you know the I think a great presentation, and I know you've been to really good ones, and I have too, and then you've been to really bad ones. I think it starts with a really good presenter. Being an engaging and passionate presenter is really important, and having a clear and focused message. So I think that's the most important thing, and then couple that with really good visuals. Um, then you have a recipe for a really good presentation. So I think in terms of just the visual piece, the things that make it really good are sticking to these design tips, which I'm going to share with you in a second. I have 7 of them that are pretty easy to follow. I shared some of them in that screen share that I did, but I'll share all 7 of them. But I think following good visual design tips. So you want to make sure things are easy to read. You want to make sure you have visuals that really convey your ideas, or like I said, add value. You want to really think about in your presentation, how can I provide visuals that make abstract ideas more concrete? So is it a diagram? Is it a picture that's so you want to think about that. And then you really want to, as a presenter, think about what kind of examples can I use that are going to connect with my audience. One of the things that we know is so important for learning is connecting, existing knowledge we have with new information. And so as a presenter, I feel like you should always be thinking about, how do I do that? And can I add visuals that will really help drive that message home, really help make that connection? So, I mean, to me, that's a really important thing. I'll show you. Actually, I did on that order of operations idea, I was looking for some examples of how could I make this idea of order of operations connect with kids and or my students. What would they remember? And so I did a search and found some ideas for visuals. And an example would be like making a sandwich and that you do it you follow these certain steps. And in order to do that, you make a good sandwich. So there's an example of me maybe showing a picture of a sandwich as I talk about this, and I'm trying to connect, this new information of order operations with the existing knowledge they have of making a sandwich. So I think those kind of things really make for a good presentation.
So, and what do you do? Like, so say you have someone who has some, let's say they created the first slide of the DSU slide that you had,
Yeah.
and it's almost like maybe they've got some anxiety of like, well, I've got to include all these things, like all these things I find important, so I've got to figure out a way to keep everything in the one slide. What do you do with someone to help them decide what to include and what to leave out? Because if we look at the transition from the first slide to the second, you can see some things, right? They disappear, some things move. So what do you do with someone if they have a slide like that? How do you approach that with helping them address those items on there?
Yeah. So I think, so this is something that I want people to think about. And so if I was helping somebody, I would ask them this, like, sometimes I think we get confused. We get these two things confused. Am I creating a handout? Am I going to create something that I would give my audience that they would read? Or am I creating visuals that I'm going to show as I speak to really highlight and illustrate key ideas? So sometimes people treat these two things the same. They're putting their presentation together, and really it's a handout. The information's important. They want people to read it. And it doesn't mean it shouldn't ever be shared. It just maybe should be shared in a different way. So I try to get them to think about, there's a difference here, right? So if you have all that information and it's really important for your audience, then let's give them a handout, or, send them to a website that they can read later if you don't want to hand out print materials. But just recognize that there's a difference between these two things. So that's the first part. That way you don't have to tell people, well, get rid of all that stuff, it's not important. You can say, yeah, it's still important, but you don't need to share it while you're doing your presentation. You can pull out the things that are the most important, put those on your slide and talk about it, and really have those viewpoints stick with your audience, as opposed to lots of words that they may not remember any of it. So I think that's part of it. And then just looking at your slides, like I've helped people, they say, look at my slides, can you do things? And some of the things I'll say, I'll just ask them questions like I pulled up on those tips questions, like, what on this slide, what's the most important thing? What do you really want to get? What do you want them to take away from this slide? And when you start to think about the most important thing, then maybe there are other things that can be removed. So those are, asking those questions and then making that distinction between what's a handout and what's actually visuals that's going to illustrate my points as I'm speaking.
Right. I think that's kind of interesting too. And I in my brain, I'm going back to your Thomas Jefferson quote to it, don't use two words when one will do. Don't use two images when one will do as well.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And so to me, that connects, that makes sense. So yeah, I like how those are coming together in that way. So you mentioned, your 7 design principles. Do you want to share those now with us? 'Cause it seems like a good time for that.
Yeah, perfect. So let me, I'm going to jump back over to my screen share here, and I'll just pull up my list. All right. So, I'll go back to my slide that has just those 7, and I won't go through the whole presentation, but I'll just touch on them briefly. So, these are the 7 design tips, and you could change this to 6 or to 8 or to 9. These are just 7 that I feel like are important, and I feel like these are all very doable. You don't have to have a graphic design degree to do these things. They're very manageable and doable. So the first 2 kind of relate to each other, keeping it simple and limiting text and bullet points. Like you said, Jeremy, don't use 2 images when one will do. That kind of connects with keeping it simple. So just really think about what's the point you want to get across, and then do that in a really simple way that really drives home your point. And then those next two on the list, using great visuals and making sure visuals add value, those two kind of relate to each other too. Using great visuals is very subjective. But I'll just show you an example of what I mean by great visuals. So if I was going to talk about, I was going to tell, let's say I'm doing a presentation, I'm going to tell a story about going to a carnival. I could find clip art like this, or I could find clip art like this. And I think this one is a better example of a visual. It's more interesting. It's colors are vibrant, and we might be able to connect with that in a different way. Here's another one. If we're talking about gravity, you could show this one, clip art, pixelated, doesn't look good at all. Or if we're talking about gravity, we could show an interesting picture like this, of this lamb up in the air, and use that as a launching point to talk about gravity. So great visuals is a very subjective one, but I think just think about what would be interesting to your audience. And now there's a lot of good tools out there to find good visuals. And then the second piece of that relates to it is really that idea of making sure the visuals add value, like I talked about, like make sure it's a visual that helps convey your points. Utilizing white space, I talked about that. It's really important. Make sure your items have room to breathe. Unifying the design and creating contrast are both really important as well. Unifying the design is one that is maybe on this list in some ways. It can be maybe one of the more challenging ones. I'll show you what I mean by unifying the design. So when I start to put together a presentation and I'm really thinking about the visuals, I try to be consistent with my fonts. So here's my font list. I'm going to use this font where it says titles, and I'm going to have it in a colored rectangular box. The text on the slides is just going to be text like that. And then if I have questions, I'm going to use this script font. So I'm going to limit my fonts to 2 or 3. That's it. Every slide is going to only use those 2 or 3. And then colors, I have a lot of colors here. This is normally I would probably have 3 to 5 colors, and that's all I'm going to use throughout the whole presentation. So limiting text, the number of fonts that you use, and then deciding on a color palette, those things really help unify the design. And then here's another illustration of how you could do this. So here's a poor example, and this came from a book. I think this came from the book Presentation Zen, which has been around a while. It's popular. Here's an example of where the design is not unified. And what I mean by that is we have all sorts of different types of images or visuals around this 8 ways to improve health. So we have clip art, the apple. We have kind of clip art icon-y type things, the broccoli, the hiking boot. We have an icon that's white. We have an icon that's in a circle. We have a photograph of the salad. We have a photograph of the kids. So we have photographs, icons, graphics, all different colors, all different styles. And that can be distracting for learners. So, and it just doesn't look as professional as if we were to unify it. So here's this same slide with a more unified design. So same thing, 8 ways to improve health, but all of these are icons inside of these squares with rounded edges, and they're white. And so we are doing the exact same thing, but we've unified design, and we've been really consistent in our visual approach. So this one is tricky because, finding those things can be hard. But the nice thing is we're going to talk a little bit about tools later. There are some really good tools to help with those type of things too. So unifying the design. And then the last one is creating contrast. So contrast is important. And contrast, we often think about contrast just simply as like colors. So here is really good contrast. Here is not good contrast. Here's another example of kind of poor contrast. So we want to have we want to have dark backgrounds and white text, or light backgrounds and dark text. But we also can create contrast with not just with dark and light, but with the different styles. So watch what happens to this slide when I add contrast. And the contrast that I'm adding here is I'm changing this, the font color, the font weight. And so that adds contrast. It kind of highlights certain things. So you can almost see that this one, when I add that contrast, it makes those years stand out a little more. So there you can see when I've added the contrast, how 1881, 1880, they stand out a little more. So if you have things that you really want to highlight to users, contrast can really help do that, either through colors or through styles of fonts and things like that. So there's that list. And so those are 7 things that I think are really helpful and important for remembering when you're doing visual design.
Yeah, and I like how you you help the audience differentiate between things, because like if you have how your question font was different.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because the first time an audience sees that, you might have to prompt them, but I feel like then the second, third time that you might have a question, they're already going to associate that font with, oh, it's another question, then I'm going to partake in this conversation or answer the question. So it's really interesting to see that.
Yep.
One other interesting thing that was going through my head here as you were going through your principles too, and I'm not sure if the intention is there or not, but it also made your slides, your visuals, your presentation feel much more accessible to people with disabilities or other impairments, right? And is that a natural consequence of following these principles, you think, or is that something you're consciously considering as you do it at the same time?
I think it's so I think it's a natural consequence, because I feel like, for me personally, that's an area that I need to improve on, is thinking about accessibility. But we know there are specific things we can do to make our visuals more accessible to everybody. So you're spot on. Like it totally can impact that for our audience. I feel like in the case of my slides, it's kind of more maybe just it happened by chance. I feel like that's an area where I need to be more intentional and deliberate about that, because you can totally make things more accessible for your audience by using these principles.
Yeah, I really feel that way. I feel like
Yeah.
it does a good job of just making sure it just happens,
Yeah.
and it should be something that we consciously consider, but you're right. And I think
Yeah.
it's something that definitely we all need to work on.
Yeah.
It is interesting though, because it made me, it's kind of reminiscent of like captions when you see them on your TV. I mean, it's typically going to be the black box with the white text, and that
Yep.
kind of follows what you're saying, Jeremy, about
Yep.
that's already maybe taking into account the accessibility, but it matches the stuff that Kevin has as the design principles too. So it's interesting. So just thinking about like with the advent of AI and all the stuff that has come about with that, what are some ways that maybe you would show us a little bit just with certain tools like a chat GPT, and Jeremy and I have covered a bunch of different AI tools because it's so prevalent in education now. What are some ways that you use tools like that to incorporate the ideas that we've been discussing?
So, that's interesting. I feel like I haven't used it as much as I should be. I haven't used ChatGPT as much as I should be, because I've just been thinking about these ideas. But for me personally, I'm trying to get in the habit of thinking about ChatGPT as a teaching assistant. So I'm thinking about when, if I had a really good assistant, somebody that I could just bounce ideas off of, what would I ask it? So let me show you some examples of what I mean by that, and how you could potentially use this to do some of these things I've talked about. So let me, I'll share my screen again, and I'll show you a couple ideas here. All right, so I'll start a new one. So I put together some text. So I went back to one of those slides that had all that text about order of operations. And that was really just a way to illustrate a slide that had too much info on it. So let me go back so you can see what I'm talking about. So I'll go all the way back to this slide. So I'm going to share information on the order of operations with my audience. And I decided that all of this information is really important, but I know I need to keep it. I know I need to keep it simple. So I'm going to use ChatGPT to help me simplify this. So I'm going to take all this text. So I just put it into a Google Doc, and just so I could copy it, and I'll put it over here. And I'm just going to ask ChatGPT. I'm going to say I'm working on a presentation for my middle school math students on the operations. So when I'm using ChatGPT, I always try to give it some context. I find that I get better results if I am specific about what I'm looking for. So I'm working on this presentation for my middle school math students on the order of operations. I have a lot of text. I want to simplify it. Here is what I have. Let's see what it says. I'll just paste in that block of text. So, I mean, I'm not sure that for this particular example that you would need ChatGPT to help you. You know, I felt like my illustration there with all those words was kind of an exaggerated example, but you can see how it took all that text, and now I could put this on the slide. And just by doing that, I've already made huge improvements. You know, and of course, I think it's really important for you as the human to look at this with a critical eye and make sure that what it gave back to you was accurate, and what you want to convey. But it does a really nice job of simplifying things. Let me do.
Okay, I'm looking at it. I think it's kind of funny because you told it was a middle school audience, so it just now it wants to connect it with a little bit of humor because it knows ChatGPT must know middle schoolers.
Right, exactly. And then, you know, the other nice thing is if I said, you know what, that's still, maybe let me just see what happens if I say still too much info, simplify it a little more. Let's see what it does now. So it even simplifies it even further. So you could, you know, you can sort of decide, and it even goes beyond that. So, so just like, I think that's, you know, one way to use ChatGPT. I think keeping our information really simple is important. And you could even put in there, when you give it the prompt, you could say, the most important thing I want to convey is this, and see what ChatGPT does to help you come up with something. Another way you could use this tool is, like I said, like we want to find visuals to help convey our ideas. So let me give it a prompt to see what it can help me with there. And so this is the part where sometimes finding visuals to convey your idea, that it takes some, like, that can be hard. Like something, you know, if something's not popping in your head right away. So maybe ChatGPT can help. So let's say I'm going to continue this thread here. Can you help me come up with good examples and visuals to really drive home the point and importance.
It's so much fun to type while you're talking
yes,
while you're being recorded.
Yes, I bet. Okay, so here we go. So let's see what it says about this. It's working. So it's giving me some examples. So I don't know, this isn't exactly what I was looking for with the examples, but actually they're not bad. And then the visuals, this is kind of what I was thinking about here. Create a branching path with multiple routes. So maybe that would generate some ideas. How about a visual that connects with something that middle school students could connect with? Let's see what it says about that. So there's kind of an idea. So if you wanted something that they could connect with, building a burger, and you could pull in the different pieces to try to, again, this would be just to try to connect with stuff they're familiar with, getting ready in the morning, video game power-ups. So I think just, using ChatGPT to do some of these things that I'm talking about, simplifying, coming up with visuals that convey your message. I think that ChatGPT can be a really nice resource for helping do those kind of things.
So, Kevin, just when you're designing things, where do you draw inspiration from for the creative pieces of your presentations?
Or even your books, your illustrations too.
Yeah.
You know?
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of looking here at my notes. Yeah. So inspiration for me is definitely, the world around me, the things that I like and the things that I think are funny. So, I mean, I love movies. I love sports. I really try to keep my finger on the pulse of pop culture. I think that's important. If you're a teacher, keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on with students. What do they like? What are they into now? And then, um, using those ideas for inspiration. Sometimes I feel like in education specifically, there's a disconnect between the world we live in and then the education and the classroom that we attend. And so if we can help sort of bring some of those things that students are doing outside of the classroom into the classroom in visuals, whatever, I think that's really that's kind of where I get my inspiration, and I'm on social media quite a bit. So I use Instagram. I love Instagram for inspiration. I follow artists and illustrators and teachers. And yeah, I just feel like that's a great source for me for getting inspiration for things.
Are there specific tools that can help, or software applications that you think help to bring your inspirations to life?
Yeah, I do. So I'm a Mac user. So all of the presentations that I build, I use the presentation tool on the Mac Keynote. So it'd be similar to PowerPoint. I like Keynote. It's just the interface works, how you can control the position of things on your screen. I love it. It's just the workflow is really easy for me. Um, but the graphics tool that I feel like um, has taken us by storm in some ways is Canva. So Canva has just, it's a web-based graphics tool. I feel like most people have heard about it or know about it. And they have done such a good job of helping people create good visuals by doing things like giving them templates. They have really good kind of education materials that you can learn about, like how do you select fonts, and they do things like helping you select color palettes and helping you remove the background of images so that things fit together better. So I feel like Canva is just an amazing tool for, that's easy to use, low cost. That's one of the nice things about this. At one point when we had graphics tools, it was like you had to be a professional graphic designer and have Photoshop or Illustrator. And now those things are still, great for professionals, but for teachers, for people that are creating presentations now, things like Canva, they're just awesome.
Yeah, and I think it's very. I personally love Canva as well, and I've used it a ton, and Jeremy has used it as well. And I feel like the one thing that is nice about that tool as well is I feel like anybody can dive into that tool. It's extremely accessible, and while they have a mass of things that are available to you, I've never in any way felt like it's overwhelming. Like I feel like I've been able to, work through the different things that they have or upload my own stuff, and I like it a lot.
And here's an interesting thing about that. Like, I feel like I feel like at one point everybody used PowerPoint. That still maybe is the majority. Maybe the majority of people use PowerPoint, but in some ways, PowerPoint led us down this path of lots of text and lots of bullet points.
Yeah.
It was almost like
Mhm.
their initial templates were like, here's your title, and here's this huge block and we've got it set up so you can use 20 bullet points. But Canva is really different than that, right? I feel like Canva is based on better visual designs. So just people without having any training, you just end up with things that look better. So, yeah, I think it's a great tool for everyone. And like you said, I mean, so easy. I have elementary students can learn to use Canva and start to, and I think teaching even young students about visual design is important.
Yeah, and it's funny because as a teacher, when I taught, I always used PowerPoint at early on, and
Yep.
for college as well. And then I feel like Google was big, so then I moved to Google Slides, and I use Google Slides primarily. And now I've abandoned all of it entirely, and I make pretty much everything in Canva. So
Yeah.
it's been interesting, just like riding
Yeah.
that wave.
Yeah.
So,
So the other, another tool that I do use, and I see these tools, this happens a lot with tech tools. I feel like they continue to add features and they sort of start to, merge, they kind of start to look similar. But the tool that that I used to use a lot with my students was Adobe. It started out as Adobe Voice, and then it was Adobe Spark, and now it's Adobe Express. And I don't know if you've looked at Adobe Express, but the interface looks very similar to Canva. And the edge that I would give Adobe Express over Canva is like in some of their video creation tools that are in there. You can do a better job, I feel like, with adding audio, and you can really do more almost like, very basic video editing in Adobe Express. Canva has video features, but I feel like that's an area that isn't great yet on Canva. But anyway, I feel like as these tools sort of compete for users, they just continue to add features and they just get better and better.
So finally, Kevin, if you had one key piece of advice that you could give to anyone looking to improve their presentation skills, what would that be?
So, just like so many things in our lives, I feel like there's an art and a science to it. Whether it's teaching or designing visuals, there's an art and a science. And with visual design, some people just naturally have a good eye for design. Jeremy, you said that about your wife, like she just has an eye for it, right?
Yep.
And I feel like that is the art of design, and it's hard to teach that. Some people just have that. But with visual design, there's also a science to it. And the science are those things that I mentioned, like understanding what white space is and how to use it and the value of it, understanding how to select fonts, knowing how important contrast is, being intentional about your visuals. So the science is kind of learning some of those basic visual design principles, and it doesn't mean you have to get a degree in it. You can just learn those basic principles and you can really sort of have the science under your belt. And I've seen it with my own students, how they, at the start of this graduate class I teach, how they will say my visual design skills are terrible. And by the end, it's such a transformation because they've learned some of these basic principles. So, my advice is if you're interested in this, and I hope you are, because I feel like visual design is so important. There's a lot of research that shows us that learning can be enhanced. You can have greater gains in learning by having good visuals. So I hope people are interested in it. But my advice would be to just work on learning some of those basic principles. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. I mean, you can just go to Google and do a search, and you'll find YouTube videos or videos on Vimeo that talk about what are some of these basic principles. And there's so many great ways for people to sort of be self-taught on these things. And it can really make a difference in your presentations, in your teaching and things like that. So I would say, my advice is be aware of how important it is, and then just do a little bit of work to learn some of those principles.
great. For those that are interested and want to learn more about the things that you've talked about, or even see some work that you've done, what would be the best places to reach you or see some of that work with your social media tags, or the children's book that you've done and things like that? What can you share with us there?
Sure. Thanks for asking that. So I'm active on Instagram and on Twitter, X. So my social media is just Kevin Smith SD. So at Kevin Smith SD on both of those platforms. I'll also share my website with you. It's kevindsmith.org. So you can go there, and I have links to my socials and links to presentations I've done and things like that. And then, I'd love it if people were interested in learning more about my illustration and my book. If you go to my website, you can find a copy of my book. Here's the book. It's called Yucky. This one's kind of worn out because I've used it so much, but this is the book. I wrote it and illustrated it. It was published in 2023. It's about this girl. There, I'll put it up there. It's about this girl, Lily, that doesn't like math. She doesn't like math because she thinks it's only about doing calculations, and she has a creative mind. And she has a teacher that helps her see the connection between art and math. And it kind of fuels her fire for, hey, maybe math isn't so yucky. I didn't realize that math involved these things that I was interested in. So yeah, if you'd like a copy of the book, you can go to my website and check it out. And one of the things I do for classrooms is I'll read the book to classrooms. So, and you can be anywhere. Like I'll just connect with your classroom via Zoom, read the book, and then do some drawing activities with students and talk about the importance of having a positive attitude about math. So yeah, I'd love it if you check that out.
That's great.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
We'll put all that in the show description for the viewers. So if you're wanting to check any of that out, which we encourage you to do, look at the description and you'll find information from what Kevin described there. So thanks again, Kevin, for joining us. Really appreciate your time and all the tips that you had for us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thanks, Jeremy, for having me.